Okay. Well, we're now on my phone. We'll see how this goes.
Okay.
Okay. We just mentioned that there were different opinions of what happens when it's all different brachas and you're reciting a bracha on each thing. I did want to add that we tried to explain Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda says that when it's one bracha, you need to recite the bracha on the 7 species food, and that bracha will exempt the other food items. So, for example, you have an apple and you have a olive. So the olive, you recite the bracha on the olive, and that is going to exempt the apple because you said a ha'etz. That's the correct bracha. But you first recite the bracha on the olive because it's from the 7 species, and then afterwards you will recite the bracha on the. Afterwards, you will recite the bracha. Afterwards, you can eat the apple without a bracha because it is exempt from the bracha that you recited on the olive. However, if you had a olive and a radish, that would be 2 separate brachas. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to agree to the rabbis that you don't need to give precedence to the 7 species, the olive, and therefore you could recite the bracha on the radish first, and afterwards you would recite the bracha on the olive. Now, the question was, why is that? If you have to give respect to the 7 species, why don't you give respect to the 7 species by making the 7 species bracha come first? Why would Rabbi Yehuda admit to the rabbis in a case where the brachas are different? What would be his reason? So we tried to explain, well, they are different laws. One bracha is exempting other things. The other case is you're saying you are reciting a bracha on the 7 species. So you are giving it some element of respect. But it still deserves a little more explanation. It deserves respect. Maybe it should have the bracha first. So one of the later commentaries wants to add a little point to this, and he explains as follows. He explains that when you have 2 food items that are the same bracha, you have the mechanism, how this works is you recite a bracha on one food item, and the other food item is sort of pulled, it tags along with the first food item. But the first food item is really what you're reciting the bracha on. The second food item is almost like it's a secondary. The bracha somehow is able to manifest itself as well on the other foods. So the scenario is that you're reciting a bracha ha'etz. Let's say you said the bracha ha'etz on an apple, and you're exempting an olive with that. So the problem is that you cannot recite a bracha on an apple and then say, you know what, the 7 species will tag along with an apple. You can't do that because they are special food items. They don't just tag along. You don't just have 7 species tag along with some other simple fruit. They don't fall into that category of tagging along, and that rule is an important rule because it does apply in halacha in other scenarios. So the idea of something tagging along, Reb Yehuda says, applies to the 7 species as well, that you cannot have 7 species tag along and be exempted from a bracha you recited on an apple. But if you do it the opposite way, it's fine.
I have a question.
This is adding a whole new understanding. I think it really gives a much better understanding. I'm sorry, Robert, was that you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if you can see us on your phone, but I have a question. I guess I'm sort of, it's gray area. Are we saying there's a hierarchy for saying the brachot, or your preference for one particular item over another? I'm just trying to understand some of the rationale that goes into which bracha you say relative to what you're eating.
Okay, so here we're talking about you're reciting one bracha, and you're going to exempt a few food items.
But how do you make the choice out of the one bracha? Does it matter what you have in front of you?
So it does matter.
Okay.
According to Reb Yehuda, because of the mechanics of how a bracha works, if you look into the mechanics, how it works, it comes out that you cannot recite the bracha on an apple and exempt an olive. Why? Because the way a bracha works is that the bracha falls on the food item you recited on, and any other item that falls in that category of that bracha that you have in mind you're going to be eating, or that's in front of you, those food items are going to tag along with the first food item that you recited the bracha on. That's the mechanics of a bracha. So initially, before I shared this thought with you, we always assumed that the bracha is on all fruits. I recited a bracha ha'etz on the apple, right, and it also includes the olives and everything else. No, in the way we're explaining it now is, no, it doesn't work that way. The bracha was not on apples and olives. The bracha was on the apple. The olives are called grara. They tag along. They are pulled along with the apple. They are considered secondary to the apple. And this is why Rabbi Yehuda says it won't work if you want to recite a bracha and exempt the 7 species. You got to recite the bracha on the 7 species and have the other foods tag along with the 7 species. Because that's the way the mechanics of bracha works, that other foods tag along, and you can't have 7 species that are so precious. They're so precious, they're such a significant food item, they can't just tag along. It's almost like saying the king tagged along with me when I was taking a walk. The king, the proper thing to say would be, I tagged along with the king.
Rabbi, didn't we earlier say that it depended?
Just 1 second.
I'm sorry.
Just 1 second. Just 1 second. Ben is asking a question. Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to say what it seems to me is, if the bracha is the same on both items, then the 7 species take precedence. If they're going to get each a separate bracha, it's not as bad a delay for the second bracha. So you can do the tznon first, and then the 7 species, if it's a separate bracha for each.
Hello?
But you have, yeah.
Oh, okay. You didn't freeze. Okay. So the thing is, that's correct. This is how we are explaining Rabbi Yehuda. Now, this is not explaining the rabbis. This is explaining the view of Rabbi Yehuda, why he would agree to the rabbis. Simone, did you want to say something?
I thought we had said at an earlier point that it also depended if the item is the main, like you have a salad, and it's a salad of apples and pears and walnuts and lettuce and all kinds of different things, and just like a little bit, there's a couple olives here and there, that really still is not about the olives, it's about the other parts of the salad. So in that case, the olives would be a secondary, and it would have to be secondary. Didn't we say that before?
Yeah, you're bringing up a good point. That is correct. That an olive could be considered it could be used for another purpose. In other words, we're not saying that you're not allowed to use 7 species foods for other purposes than just than main meals. But what we are saying is, if you're reciting a bracha and you have to recite the bracha on both, then the bracha should be recited on the olive. Now, your example is a case where you don't need a bracha on that because it is considered part of the other food. And even though it's a 7 species, from the 7 species, it really is part of the salad. It's not really an entity that needs a bracha. But if it is an entity that needs a bracha, that would be obligation, according to Rabbi Yehuda, to recite the bracha on the 7 species, because they do not get tagged. They don't get tagged along with the other bracha when they need a bracha of their own, when they are an entity. Here, your example is where they're not really considered an entity.
The salad, though, is made up of multiple items, so each one still gets its own bracha.
Not necessarily. So again, your example was that there's like a main salad and then there's a few things that are like thrown into it. So you're going to be eating those olives together with a tomato, and the main thing in the salad is the lettuce and the tomatoes and the cucumbers. And it happens to have a few olives, which add a little salt and flavor. But it would seem that the main salad is the vegetables there. And possibly you wouldn't recite even a bracha on the olives. Again, it would probably depend on what your main purpose in having the olives. Some people really enjoy olives. Other people just want a little flavor from the olives to be included in their tomatoes and lettuce when they're eating it. So it would probably depend on your intent if you're having a large amount of olives and so on.
Really?
Okay, so
Really?
Yes, Moshe.
If it's shredded, if the olives are shredded and you have carrots that are shredded in it, let's say what they call a Greek salad or I forget, there's another name for it, Italian salad, whatever it is, and it's got shredded olives and it's got shredded carrots and cut up tomatoes, small cherry tomatoes. How would that be? That's also, you say you don't have to say the berachot over the other.
Again, it would probably depend on what your intent in that salad is when you're eating it. You know what I mean? Some people eat a whole Greek salad just because they like the sheep cheese. You know what I mean? And then the other stuff is just like secondary. So the whole purpose is all the sheep cheese. Some people just put a little drop of the feta cheese on it, and their main thing is the vegetables. I guess it depends on the intent of the person eating it.
I see. Okay, thank you.
And if you specifically want all those items, then you would recite each one individually. It probably, each one would be. But if one is generally, we would go by majority. I should emphasize that also to Simone, that generally we would go by majority. But if there is a specific importance that you have in each of the food items, you might want to recite a bracha on a additional food item that's not mixed in the salad, and this way exempt the other food items, because that is a important. It's considered an important food for that you're interested in eating, and maybe it wouldn't, similar to this idea that it maybe doesn't just tag along, it's really an integral part, but there is a concept of majority that would apply. And the other thing would be if they're large, like for example, let's say you have a fruit salad that has some type of ho'adama in it. Good example. But if you had vegetables in the fruit salad, I'm not sure. I can't think of what vegetable would fit. But if you did have a definite ho'adama in so it depends on maybe how big the fruit pieces are, because if each food is eaten
cabbage is a big. Sometimes it's a cabbage salad.
What is that?
Cabbage.
Cabbage inside a fruit salad? Uh-huh.
No, it's a cabbage
like
salad, but you can add fruit to it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but that would probably be the cabbage would be the majority. That would be a good example of you follow the majority. But what I think there's some people put some type of a rhubarb in their like some type of vegetable inside their fruit salad. So if they have if they're big pieces, so that each piece is eaten on its own, so you're not really
banana.
Banana.
Did we lose him again?
That would discuss the specific details of salads that are mixed. But I'm guessing that if they're large pieces, that you're eating each piece on its own. In other words, you can't fit more than one piece on your fork or spoon. So then it wouldn't be considered like a mixed salad. It's really like entities of its own that just happens to be mixed together and sharing some flavor. That would be my thought. Okay, so this is the initial Gemara that we started, and we're going to continue in the Gemara. Just one thing on the previous Gemara, I should also mention, I do not see everyone on this Zoom because I'm using my phone because we had a problem with the computer. So if you have a question, You might want to, you can call out because I don't really see your hand. So feel free to, interrupt me, not too much, but you can interrupt me. The Gemara before, that's right. I mentioned that when it came to the law of Demai, we spoke about the laws of Demai. Demai was when we're not sure if the person who you got your produce from, if they separated the proper miser. So we mentioned that the rabbis established a law that you have to separate to be sure. You have to separate miser again, and the miser you separate. You don't have to give to the Levite, and you don't have to give to the poor person, because we're not sure. It could be they got their portion already, but you do separate it. You separate it, and you then can eat it. And if they can prove that they never got their miser, they never got their tithing, then you would give it to them. But there's no way that they're going to ever prove that. So therefore, you would just eat it and enjoy it without giving them their tithing, because there's no way for them. There's no way to know if it was tithed or not. Now, the reason why you have to separate the Meiser Risha and the first Meiser that you're not giving to the Levite, you're separating it. And the reason you separate it is in order to separate a portion that goes to the Kohen. And that portion is called Trumas Meiser. The Levite, when he gets your tithing, he's supposed to give a portion to the Kohen. So when you are not giving the Levite his portion, you got to separate that and give it to the Kohen. I mentioned that I wasn't sure, maybe you could sell it to the Kohen. And the reason I said you could maybe sell it to the Kohen is you can't eat this truma, it's called Trumas Meiser, because it's holy and it can only be eaten by Kohens. But who says it wasn't separated already? It could be that the Levite got his portion and it was given to the Kohen. And therefore, my thought is that maybe you could sell it to the Kohen and say, listen, I don't know if you got yours or not. I'm separating it. I'm not eating it. But if you want it, I'll sell it to you for 50 cents on the dollar. And because you can't prove that you never got it, you might have received it. And therefore, I should be able to sell it to you. So I looked it up. It turns out that there's a argument about this, if you can sell it to the Kohen or not. And there is a Rashi that says, Rashi in Tractate Soita, he says that you can't sell it to the Kohen because the rabbis didn't want you to hold on to it. And therefore, they said, when they made the decree of Demai, they made the decree that you have to give it to the Kohen. This way, you get rid of it right away. Because if you sell it, you're going to wait till someone buys it, and you might end up by mistake eating it. So that would be one of the reasons. That's Rashi's explanation. There is another explanation that since it's only a 100th of the food, because it's a tenth of a tenth. In other words, you gave the Levite 10% of your fruits, and the Levite takes off 10% and gives it to the Kohen. So because it's a 100th, it's such a tiny, minute amount. Therefore, when you're separating it, the rabbis did not say sell it to the Kohen. They said you give it to the Kohen because it's such a tiny amount. It's not a big loss. And
Rabbi, how do you get proof that this was accomplished? I mean, you have to get a piece of paper that says I gave to the Kohens, or how does that work?
How does it work? So basically, the way it works in Israel is like nowadays there are stores that there are rabbinic supervision on the store, and the store separates the store. They guarantee that they've separated all the separations that are necessary. Now, if you buy from your friend, so it depends. If you buy from a knowledgeable person, someone who comes to the Levi Yitzchok Senior Academy, so you're sure that they divided, you're sure that they separated all the tithings. But if you go buy from someone in the street, you don't know if they did. So you would be in that situation where you don't know if you can trust. If they're scholarly, knowledgeable, and they follow the laws, then they did. But if they're ignorant, so there you would be in the scenario called demai. The produce would be called demai produce, where it's unsure. And this is the scenario where you would separate certain food item, you'd have to eat like, for example, you'd separate the tithing that's supposed to be eaten in Jerusalem, and you bring that to Jerusalem just in case. Maybe it wasn't separated. You'd separate the Levite separation, but you don't have to give it to the Levite, but you do have to take a percentage off it to give to the Kohen or to sell to the Kohen. Again, this is an argument. Rashi and Tosfos both say that you have to give it to the Kohen, but there is the Torah brings in the Shulchan Aruch, chapter 331, he says that you could sell it. You sell it to the Kohen. So it seems like it's an argument among the Rishonim, among the commentaries of the Talmud, if you could sell it to the Kohen.
One more
or you have
question.
to give it to the Kohen. Yes.
One more question. Okay. So the fruit is going to go bad before I get it to Israel. So I sell it.
No. We don't deal with it. You don't deal with it. The only issue that you have to deal with here in America is if food comes from Israel, it needs to be tithed. So, for example, now in
So if I go to South Florida Kosher, I know that company has bought correct fruit and vegetables. If I go to
Right. But if you go to South Florida Kosher and they have produce from Israel, let's say they have carob that they're selling for Tu B'Shvat, they want to sell some Israeli produce.
Right.
So they have some stuff that grows in Israel, and they import it from Israel. So yeah, they have carob. So you can rely on South Florida Kosher. They're owned by a very religious Jew, and he's going to be obviously very careful that he's not buying produce that might have a question that needs to be tithed. The same thing as Israeli wine. It has a supervision on it. You wouldn't have to worry. But but you do have to be careful if you ever see that these oranges are from Israel, Jaffa oranges. They're selling in Publix, or they have peppers sometimes from Israel. And now I'm told that there are some pomegranates that are being sold from Israel right now. It just came out. So these things you have to be careful and ask you should find out if they're sold, if they're from Israel, because if you buy peppers or pomegranates in Publix that are from Israel, you could be in a few issues. Either they might be obligated to take tithings from it. The other thing is it might be considered Shemitah fruit. So it has so it's complicated. So it's better if you don't buy it. It sounds surprising. It sounds surprising because we would love to give business to Israel. On the other hand, the business that we
don't want to do it in the wrong way. You don't want to do it in the wrong way.
We have to be sure that we're not going to transgress. So the easiest way to give business to Israel is buying products that have a rabbinic supervision, or reliable rabbinic supervision, that are from Israel. But if you're buying, that doesn't apply to pomegranates and peppers that are sold in Costco or in Publix or some other places.
Right.
Or oranges might be, because sometimes are an issue that they're Jaffa oranges. Yes, Moshe.
Romaine lettuce used to come from Gush Katif, before Pesach, used to get a lot of it in most of the kosher supermarkets. That was, I guess it was some of the best romaine lettuce that I think you could find, because there were very few bugs. You wouldn't find many bugs on it. But right. That was something that I guess it was, the trim was taken off the top.
I would assume. I think they were very religious in that whole development.
Yes, they were.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the Gemara. So we were talking about the argument of Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, and Ula said that this only applies when the brachas are the same. And Gemara asked the question, So we're going to start here. It's 8 lines down from the top of the page, 41a. 41a, the last word on the line, Meisvei. Meisvei, the Bnei Yeshiva asked the question, if a person had in front of him Snoin, a radish, Vizayas, and an olive, he recites the bracha on the Snoin, and he exempts, the Snoin is the radish, and he exempts the olive. Now, what do we see from here? That when you have brachas that are not the same, nevertheless, we see that you recite a bracha on the main food, and you exempt anything else, even if it's a different bracha. So, according to this, it would seem that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you would have to recite the bracha maybe when you have two food items, you only recite one bracha. And so what is he talking about, that when you have different brachas, then his law doesn't apply, and you recite the bracha on each? You don't recite the bracha on each. You have two food items, you recite the bracha on one. So the Gemara answers, no, that's totally off. And here, what are we talking about? When the tznoin is the ikr. And here we're talking about a case where you're eating the radish because you want the radish, and you're eating the olive because it's going to minimize the sharpness of the radish. And that's the scenario here where you only recite one bracha. But normally when you have two food items, you're going to have to recite a bracha on both food items. And that's what Ula was talking about, that you would recite, that everyone agrees when you recite brachas on each of the food items. Now, what's interesting is that he mentions here that the radish is the main thing, and the olive is used simply to blunt the sharpness of the radish, because there is a discussion about using an olive for maror. Is an olive considered sharp? And it's also regarding the laws of kashrus. If you put a fleshik knife or a treif knife, let's say, into an olive, does the olive, if it has sharpness, it will absorb flavor from the knife, even if it's old flavor. It'll give it a good. The knife will impart flavor, even though it's not hot, because something sharp has the same ability to absorb even something that's not hot. So, for example, if you cut a knife if you cut a onion with a treifa knife, or a lemon with a treifa knife, that would make the lemon or the onion treif, non-kosher. And the interesting thing from our Gemara, it does seem like an olive, it blunts the flavor of a radish, which would imply that that an olive is not really sharp. It's the opposite. It sort of minimizes the sharpness. In fact, there is a Rashi there's a Rashi in Chumash that brings down the Ale Zayas Taraf Befiha, that when the dove came back with the olive leaf, and the Rashi brings down that it's as if to say, I would rather have my parnasa like an olive bitter, but it's from the hands of Hashem, than to receive from the hands of basar v'dam, than to receive something sweeter, but from the hands of a basar v'dam, of a human. In other words, it's better to get it directly from Hashem, and even if it's bitter. And so Taisvis brings this as a proof. He says it's only the leaf that's bitter. It's not the actual olive. The olive is not bitter. But in Shulchan Aruch, it does mention that an olive is considered something that's bitter, and because of that, a person has to be careful that an olive would be similar to a. But anyway, it's a discussion in Shulchan Aruch if an olive is 100% bitter, or there's different opinions about it. But here, our Gemara seems to imply like maybe an olive is more something that blunts the sharpness of a radish. So maybe it's not so. Maybe it's not really bitter. Or you could differentiate between bitter and sharp. In any event, it's discussed in these two areas, regarding the laws of maror, using it for on Pesach night, if an olive could be, if someone didn't have.
Thank God, Baruch Hashem.
We mute people, please.
I think we just lost the route. There he is.
What is that? You lost me? Oh.
Yes.
No, but we needed to be muted.
Oh, okay. Let me mute everyone. Let me see. Let me try to do this 1 second. Okay. let me just read that Rashi here. Rashi over here says that she said that let my mezainis be bitter like a zayas in the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and not sweet like davash, like honey from the hands of a human. So that's the wording, but it's based on the fact that the ale zayas, the leaf of the olive. So the question is the olive bitter, or is it the olive leaf that's bitter? Okay. Anyway, so back to the Gemara. The Gemara said over here that you're having these two food items, and this olive and the radish. And in this scenario, the radish is the thing that's going to require a bracha. The olive is only secondary, and it's not really eaten for food. It's eaten just to blunt the sharpness, and therefore you would not recite the bracha on the olive. Now the Gemara says, "Ihachi," if so, ema seifa. If that's true, then what about the end of the brisa? Rabbi Yehuda, I remember Baruch al Azayas. Rabbi Yehuda says you recite the bracha on the olive, shazayis min shiva. The olive is from the 7 species. So what comes out is that obviously this olive is not so secondary, because Rabbi Yehuda says you actually recite the bracha on the olive. So it sounds like even when they're different brachas, you recite only one, and you somehow exempt all the others with that one bracha is the only bracha that's needed. So then the Gemara says, no, maybe Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of this whole law of Iker and Tafel. So the Gemara says that let me tell you where we are over here. Oh, there's an aleph on the side. V'chi. Okay. There's a little aleph in the middle over here that they add a word. V'chi lesle Rabbi Yehuda haditnan. Does Rabbi Yehuda not hold of this Mishnah that it says whatever is the main food and with it is the secondary food? You recite the bracha on the main food and the secondary food is exempt. Does Rabbi Yehuda not hold of that? And maybe that's why he says that you would recite the bracha on the olive. Again, it seems like the olive is not necessary at all to eat over here. You're not eating it for eating purposes. And maybe Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of that. And therefore, he says you recite the bracha on the olive. And maybe he means that you recite the bracha on both, and you just first recite the bracha on the olive, or you also recite the bracha on the olive, because he doesn't hold of the law of when you have something that's the main food and the other food is totally not necessary, is not really significant, and maybe he doesn't hold of that, and he says you have to recite the bracha on insignificant things as well. If you're going to say correct that he doesn't, that's true. That's also, this is so that Leslie, he doesn't hold of that rule. We have a brisa that says he does hold of that rule. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im machmas tznoin bo hazayas, if the olive comes because of if the radish comes, if the olive comes because of the radish, if because of the radish the olive comes, in other words, the radish is the main thing, and the olive is coming only because of the radish to blunt its sharpness. Rabbi Yehuda clearly says that when you have two food items and one of them is coming to blunt the flavor of the other one, so you would recite the bracha on the main food, and you would exempt the other one. So what comes out is that when Rabbi Yehuda says that you recite the bracha on the olive, it must be talking about a case where both of those food items are important, are main food items. Because if it would be secondary, then you would not be reciting the bracha on the secondary food item. It must be that both of those food items are important. They're both ikers. They're both significant. And nevertheless, it seems that the rabbis are saying that you recite the bracha on the snoin, on the radish, and you exempt the olive. And this seems to argue with Ula, who implied that when you have two types of species that have different brachas, you recite a bracha on each one. And the Gemara seems surprised that you would recite a bracha on each food item when you're having two food items. Recite one bracha. And we see that in this brisa. And even though they're both ikr, they're both main, but nevertheless, it seems like you're only reciting one bracha. So the Gemara says, no, this can't be. We have to fix up the words of the brisa because this doesn't fit with our, doesn't flow with all the other teachings. So li'olam b'tznoin ikar askinan. So the Gemara says, no, we have to explain the brisa a little differently.
Rabbi, you froze.
Yeah, well, I don't know if he hears us or not.
The radish.
Rabbi, you froze, so we didn't hear what you said for the last half minute.
Okay, let me repeat that. The Gemara said that we cannot say Reb Yehuda disagrees with this general rule that when you have an ikr and a tuffle, when you have a significant, a main food, and you have a secondary, insignificant food, that Reb Yehuda must agree with the rabbis, and everyone agrees that you only recite one bracha in such a scenario. And Reb Yehuda agrees with that. We have a proof, we have a brisa that says that. So the Gemara says it must be that the case here where Reb Yehuda says you recite the bracha on the olive, if he's saying that, it must be that the case is not where the olive is secondary and it's used only to blunt the flavor or the sharpness of the radish. It must be that the olive is a main food that you want. You're not just eating it to blunt the flavor, the sharpness of the radish. You're eating it as a main food. And if you're eating it as a main food, we see here that the brisa is saying the rabbis hold when you have two main foods, you have a radish and an olive, and they're both important. One is not being used to minimize the sharpness. They're both important. You recite only one bracha. That's what it seems like, because the case we've proven that this case must be talking about both of them are called ikers. Both of them are called main foods. And nevertheless, you recite one bracha. And this doesn't seem to fit with what Ula said before, that when you have two food items and you recite two brachas, the different brachas, you recite a bracha for each of them. And this doesn't seem to fit with what Ula said, because here we see they have these two food items, they're separate brachas, and yet the rabbi said that you would recite one bracha, and that bracha is on the radish. And this doesn't fit with Ula. So the Gemara answers and says, you know what? This doesn't fit with the rules of brachas, because it can't be that you would only recite one bracha. And the Gemara says we must re-edit that brisa. The brisa is what we're learning from this brisa. It must be missing a little paragraph there, or a few some type of qualification. So the Gemara says li'olam. We're going back into the Gemara now. Li'olam b'tznoin ikar askinan. Forever, we must be talking about that. The case here where we're retracting and saying no, back to what we initially thought. And what did we initially thought? That the main food is the radish, and the olive is used to blunt the sharpness of the radish. And v'chi pligi Reb Yehuda v'Rabbanan, where do they argue on a different case? B'milsa achriti pligi, on a different case they argue. V'chasure mechseran, there are some words missing in this brisa. So when it was transmitted, and it was, of course, transmitted by word of mouth, they must have missed out the first part of this brisa. V'hachi katani, this is the way it should read in the brisa. You have these two food items. One is a radish and one is an olive, and the olive is being used to blunt the sharpness of the radish. So everyone agrees. You recite the bracha on the radish, and you exempt the olive. And this makes sense. This is obvious. Everyone agrees with this. There's no questions. Now, when would this apply? When the radish is the main food item, and the olive is blunting the flavor, the sharpness. Now comes but if the radish is not the main thing, Divrei HaKoil, everyone would agree, Mevarech al zeh v'chayzer mevarech al zeh, that you recite two brachas on this one and on that one. Ushnei minim ba'alma, and two brachas in general, sheberchayseim shavos, not two brachas, two minim, two species, two types of foods in general that have sheberchayseim shavos, that have the same bracha, an apple and an olive. Mevarech al ezeh mehen sheyirtza, the rabbis say you recite the bracha on whichever one you want. Rabbi Yehuda says, Mevarech al hazayis, you recite the bracha on the olive, shehazayis mimin shiva, because the olive is from the 7 species. And the as I explained in the beginning part of this class, that the 7 species cannot be used according to Rabbi Yehuda. You can't say one of the 7 species is going to tag along with the main bracha. If the bracha is on an apple, and then you want to eat an olive with it, and you have in mind even that you're eating an olive with that apple, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't work, because an olive can't tag along with an apple, because an olive is from the 7 species. And therefore, you would need to recite the bracha ha'etz on the olive and let the apple tag along. But the olive never tags along because it's from the 7 species, and it's like saying the king took a walk with me. You don't say that. You can't do that. You can't say the bracha on an apple and say, oh, the 7 species, they'll tag along with the bracha. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to recite the bracha on the olive, and because it's from the 7 species, and the apple will tag along with the olive.
Rabbi,
Yes.
suppose the apples were grown in Eretz Yisrael and the olives were grown in Argentina. In other words, the 7 species refers to the 7 species from Eretz Yisrael, but they could be grown in other parts of the world. And in Eretz Yisrael, you can grow things that aren't one of the 7 species, but they come from Eretz Yisrael. So is the honor of it because it comes from the land, or is it on the fruit itself? So I buy figs and they're grown in Turkey, or I buy olives and they're grown in California. They're not from Eretz Yisrael, but I can buy an apple or pomegranate or another piece of fruit that comes from Eretz Yisrael.
Doesn't
Right.
matter.
So it doesn't matter where it's from, but it is interesting that you bring this up, because there is in Shulchan Aruch, it does mention that when you actually eat a fruit from Eretz Yisrael, from the 7 species, for example, let's say you have olives from Israel, according to the letter of the law, you should recite not the regular al ha'etz v'al pri ha'etz, but you actually end off the bracha a little differently.
Yes.
It's al ha'aretz v'al peiros seha, instead of al ha'aretz v'al ha'peiros. Instead of ending off on the land and on the fruits, from the letter of the law. Now, I don't think people follow this. At least I was in Eretz Yisrael. I don't remember anyone wording it differently. But according to the letter of the law, maybe there is such a customer. But that if you eat fruit from that actually grew in Eretz Yisrael, you actually say al ha'aretz v'al peiros seha and its fruits.
Right.
But otherwise, you just say al ha'aretz v'al ha'peiros. So we give a special bracha al ha'etz v'al pri ha'etz to anything that Israel is blessed with, even though it didn't grow in Israel. These are the fruits that Eretz Yisrael is blessed with. That is what's valued. That's what's important, and that's what that's the understanding here of what you would recite the bracha on, even though whether it grew in Eretz Yisrael or not. It is a fruit that Eretz Yisrael is blessed with. So that is the factor. But what you mentioned, that there is uniqueness to fruit that actually did grow in Eretz Yisrael. Now, it wouldn't apply to an apple grown in Eretz Yisrael, but it would apply to the 7 species grown in Eretz Yisrael, that you would recite this change in the actual little edit in that word peiros or peiros seha.
Yeah, and you wouldn't have to necessarily be in Eretz Yisrael to say that special bracha, as long as you could get it here, that's from Eretz Yisrael.